Welcome to episode 2 of The Sherveen Show, where we talk about the intersection of startups, tech, business, and society. I'm going to be chatting with Ravin. He is the CEO and co-founder of Credal.ai. We'll talk about his business, the AI landscape, his founder journey, and so much more. Hope you enjoy the show. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. This conversation, fits in the zeitgeist of AI, so I'm super excited about it. Hopefully, we'll still not be generic about what we talk about. Always hard. But a bunch of other themes that we'll get to. Ravin of Credal, do you do Credal.ai or just...
We say Credal, but people say Credal.ai all the time.
Got it. Why don't we start with, I usually hop really deep first, but before we do that, set some context for us. Give us the 3 to 15 sentence version of what are you building?
Yeah, so we're basically building a platform for enterprises to get visibility and control over the AI applications that they build in-house, right? So to give you a really simple example, like one of our customers, TransferWise, public company, they do international money transfers, right? They have this tremendous regulatory burden about what they can use generative AI for. And if they are using it, then they need to know exactly what it's doing, how it might be going wrong, and make sure they have like really deep control. So Credal gives them basically like a set of out-of-the-box tools for things like how does an LLM take an action in a way that's highly auditable, highly controlled? How do you make sure you're not sending PII out to these LLMs? We basically give you a marketplace of these tools that you can compose into whatever AI application you want, but know that when the regulator comes knocking, your AI application is going to be defensible, auditable, and like very transparent so that you know that your AIs are acting in ways that are compliant, ways that are defensible, and ways that are without bias, basically.
Before we, dive deep into, kind of founder and journey questions, from a product perspective, when you think about what you're building, I think it's super interesting for a variety of reasons, but it sounds like a lot of what someone might misperceive if they're just like meeting you at a conference or looking at the landing pages, you're really building a lot of, rails and ways for companies to your point, understand, track, be able to audit.
Yep.
How much do you consider yourself an AI company, an enterprise SaaS company? Like, where do you, even as a founder, when you like are thinking about yourself, you go, who am I? Where does your psychology on that go?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I do think of ourselves as an AI company, not in the sense that we're building AI models, because we literally don't do that, but in the sense that our software only makes sense in the world that you have these large language models that are beginning to not just like read, but operate on data in a way that is actually relevant to like running your business. Obviously, what we actually build, right, is in many ways like traditional enterprise software, right? The thing that I think makes us very different to a traditional AI company is that if you go and speak to 100 AI companies, each of them will give you a slightly different flavor of like what makes them different. Maybe it's a slightly more intelligent way to do RAG. We're doing it with graphs, or we're doing it with like ontologies, or, maybe it's like we have slightly better models than the next person. We like bought more GPUs from NVIDIA than anyone else. And that's basically the entire AI industry writ large. Our philosophy is like actually very, very different. It's not about like, can you come up with the cleverest way to do RAG that will be irrelevant next week? Can you come up with the cleverest model that someone will surpass next week? It's actually like, can you give enterprises the deepest visibility and control over what the AI is?
So you're really actually wrestling somewhat with the models themselves. Like you're almost, and not antagonistic literally, because it makes the ecosystem better, but you're almost saying, hey, when these model companies are building their tools, or they're even using, and I want to get to this too, but open source models is the problem, especially for an enterprise company, is you can't kind of have the lack of visibility, the ambiguity with what you're getting that you can if you're a consumer, just like asking it to build a grocery list for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. The one thing I'd add to that is like, in practice, like everything that you do with LLMs is obviously like non-deterministic, right? And so you want a sort of risk-reward trade-off for how much uncertainty you're willing to accept. And that trade-off is dependent on the use case. If you're like deciding whether someone's, money transfer of $10 million is legit or not, you want a very, very, very low uncertainty like decision on that threshold. If what you're doing is you're summarizing a customer support ticket You probably want like a slightly different place on the risk reward trade-off there. And so it's really about giving enterprises the control to build the applications that make sense for them, rather than we as a model company saying, or as a controls company saying, these are the controls you need, like take it or leave it.
It's the tunability in your case that really makes it. So let's dive into, the founder journey a little bit. I want to start by asking a question, and then feel free to, if it's relevant, go to the story to answer the question or answer it directly.
Yep.
What made you decide, either heuristically or again, a point in time, that the world of AI and enterprises are ready for this product? And I ask that from the perspective, I could imagine being in your shoes as someone who understands this problem, maybe drew up the first wireframe on a weekend going, as a founder, I want to wait 3 more years for enterprises to decide to embrace this, for the models to become better. Because the use cases are there, but might still be only early adopters or companies that hire their own internal safety and Rails teams or whatever it might be. So you decided at some point that the question said, let's press the go button.
Yep.
Was either the heuristic or the point in time?
Yeah, well, I remember very specifically because it was a dinner I had in Chelsea, actually, with my co-founder, Jack. So we were at this Vietnamese restaurant called Omai, which very sadly is closed down now, right? I was living in DC at the time, and I was coming up to New York to visit. I was working at Palantir, but I was working on the COVID response. So basically trying to stop America's hospitals from overflowing from COVID. And Jack was working at the Department of Defense, again, like with Palantir, but we were close friends. And I was up in New York and we were having dinner. And we were chatting about, I think this was like sort of mid 2022, right? We were chatting about deploying the open source generative models in these like very, very data sensitive environments, right? The Department of Health and Human Services dealing with people's health information, Department of Defense obviously dealing with all sorts of sensitive data as well, right? And what we realized sort of simultaneously at that dinner was that we were both dealing with this like identical trust problem, that you have this insanely powerful technology. Like even back then, we were just dealing with the open source GPT-2 model. Even then, you could tell like, holy cow, this thing is extremely powerful. There's a lot you can do with it. And like the rate of improvement of these models is sort of terrifying, right? So you could tell something very dramatic was about to happen, but you could also tell like, it's so difficult to get CIOs and people in these like positions of extreme responsibility to trust the outputs of these generative models because they're non-deterministic. And we kind of realized simultaneously, okay, the trend of what the models are capable of doing is like doing this, right? And it was obvious even then to us that every single enterprise, every single person in the world was going to become very deeply reliant on these tools in the same way that we're very deeply reliant on like our smartphones today, even though that wasn't necessarily obvious to people in 2005, 6, 7. And we sort of also realized, well, the consumer side of the technology will probably be fine. But on the enterprise side, like getting people to trust it was not just going to be a problem for the government, right? It was going to be a problem for every regulated institution in the world. Every pharma company, every financial services company, every infrastructure company, all of these enterprises were going to have the same problem. And so we chatted about it and we were like, wow, this is going to be an absolutely massive problem. And we very foolishly thought that we were like 2 or 3 years ahead of the rest of the world, like waking up to it, right? And so we chatted. We were like, we should definitely do something here. We both left Palantir like pretty much, within a week and started working on Credal. And our initial idea was completely wrong. I think our initial insight was spot on, but what we decided to build was exactly the wrong thing. We sort of figured we'd build an AI application and build into that application all of this smart, sophisticated sort of guardrails and controls and permissions management. And what happened is when we tried to sell that application, all of our prospective customers would be like, yeah, the application's like kind of interesting, I guess, but like, actually, can you tell us more about the guardrails and the security controls, because those are actually really, really compelling and really, really interesting.
I'm going to assume the application was like probably a chat where you said, hey, all of you will want to talk to your data with chat. And they went, sure, but hold on. tell me more about how.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, technically we called our application like an AI chief of staff. So we'd like absorb all of your like internal documents and sort of give like execs like strategic advice. And obviously Jack and I know nothing about being a chief of staff, right? But we do actually know like a decent amount about, building guardrails and security controls for AI. And so unsurprisingly, our prospects, our customers realize that pretty instantaneously. And we're like, you guys don't actually know anything about the product that you're building, but you do actually know something quite interesting about some of the primitives involved in building that product. And, that just pushed us very directly in the direction of the original insight which we'd had, which is how do you give those people a platform to build the tools that they want to build, but with the controls and guardrails in place that they know that they need.
Which brings me to, if I give the crowd a sense of like what I took a look at on the page, the UX of your product seems to be, at its most basic level, enterprises go in either in a GUI or a developer-facing API and say, here's all the ways in which I want you to understand guardrails around this piece of data or this several pieces of data. For example, be very willing to answer this sort of question or don't be willing to answer it.
Right.
Or, hey, this data has PII and we don't want the PII to be part of the result.
Right.
So be free to give the user a summary of insights, but not of any particular row of data. Or maybe do give them PII in some cases. So basically they're saying, hey, we're going to use, and I want to get to this too, you allow them to use any model in the version of your chat. I assume in the case where they're using it on their platform, they're using whatever model they want. But you're saying, we're going to make it easy to do the guardrail part. Is that mostly correct? Yeah,
exactly. So we give you essentially a list of tools. Like the most basic version of that tool, right, would be chat. That's like the most straightforward, simplistic, which you can use through the API or through the UI. But in practice, I think at this point, like 99% of our traffic is through the API. And what folks are doing is they're composing multiple of these different tools, whether it's chat, whether it's like reading data from your internal systems, whether it's writing data to an internal system, or, doing something completely different. Like
what percentage of that are they, using the model also alongside you? Either you're just like having them bring their API token, or you're serving the model as, provider versus, again, it's kind of, you're very much embedded as another API alongside their product and they're deploying whatever they want.
Yeah, it's a real mix, to be honest with you. Like, I'd say it's almost exactly 50-50 if you look at the amount of traffic. Some folks care a lot about owning the relationship with the model providers, be it OpenAI, Anthropic. Some folks want to bring their own like AWS Bedrock account, that kind of stuff. And other people just like don't actually care that much. One of the nice things, I guess, for some of our customers is that, if they're using us, they're getting access to sort of a like pooled kind of account with these LLM providers. So you get sort of Z-scaler effect where the LLM provider doesn't know that the traffic is coming from you, right? And that can be helpful for some folks as well. But it really is a big mix.
And I assume though, still even with the folks putting it in their platform, it has to be an LLM you support. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, yes, but at this point, basically all of the LLMs, like there are these open source libraries that will wrap the APIs for those LLMs. So you can pretty much use like any of the ones that you've heard of.
So the reason I asked that, that makes sense, but I kind of want to, let's zoom out a little bit to like industry. So, there's this Llama just, the other day, we're having this open source conversation for what feels like the millionth time. And I want to, I don't want to get in the weeds of open source versus not, who cares? It's more like, what's interesting about it to you as a founder in your journey when you see, to your point, it's like, what do you support? Okay, the world makes it easy for it to support everything. But what do you see as, you're seeing customer data, you're seeing models, you probably have a relationship with the model companies that allow you to get a little bit of a preview of what's going to happen next. Was this release interesting to you? Is this conversation interesting to you as a founder in the space? Or do you say, this is all mostly kind of the model providers' problems to figure out how they want to make revenue, and it's not going to matter for the end user?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think like when we started Credal, I sort of very much had the view that it was going to be very difficult for the open source community to keep up with the closed source community, just because the sheer volume of investor dollars that gets poured into OpenAI, Anthropic, Cohere. I don't know if this is true, but the information had like a report recently saying OpenAI are torching $5 billion a year, which is like a phenomenal amount of money to like light on fire, right? And it's hard for an open source community to keep up with that level of like research budget. Honestly, similar things happening at Anthropic, Cohere, etc. Obviously, Google was torching probably a lot more than that. And so, my view was that it was going to be difficult for the open source community to keep up with that. I think what we've seen has been really interesting, which is that the open source community has done a, like, honestly unexpectedly good job of keeping pace with the sort of benchmarks, if you like. The basic, if you go to Hugging Face, you get the LMSys leaderboard. The open source community has done a really good job of like keeping pace with those benchmarks, like approximately. Obviously, all of the top models are still the closed source models, but open source is doing reasonably well there. Where it's actually struggled has been in all of the stuff around the models themselves.
Usability.
Right. The usability, the APIs, the sort of...
Even in kind of you mentioned, the prompt response structure of these models still looks more like GPT-2 than it looks like GPT-4.
Exactly, yeah. And one of the things that was super interesting about the Llama model was, I think this was the first good open source model that had a serious context window, right? You see a lot about the Hugging Face leaderboard saying, Llama 3.0 was really competitive with GPT-4. But actually, when you're comparing 128,000 context window against like an 8,000 token context window, the difference between what you can actually do with those two things is like, very, very, very dramatic. And so that was actually one of the things that I found most impressive about this particular release is like catching up a little bit there. But in general, despite the progress of the open source models and despite the fact that they've still been, they've been doing an honestly unexpectedly good job. If you look at the rate of adoption that we're seeing from our customers, it's still actually the case that the majority of new use cases are still going into the closed proprietary models and not the...
Well, it's the same reason someone wants to be your customer, right? They want to be as close to the edge of usability as possible.
Right.
They want to be as much not concerned about the variables of usability as humanly possible.
Yeah.
Well, and then let's go to I'm going to mention an analogy that's slightly off, but I'm curious both your thoughts on what's happening with the story and if there's a similar dynamic with you. Perplexity, OpenAI, like 2 days ago, teases Search GPT, their search product. And the takes on Twitter were very much, Perplexity already exists, OpenAI is cannibalizing a customer of theirs. And it was very... Now, my take on that take that I'll just get out of the way is that's absurd. Search is core to OpenAI's use case. Perplexity is also model swappable and agnostic. So like, why would OpenAI not go, they could turn us off, use Claude. Why would we not? So that aside, though, the notion of what happened there is interesting. It's kind of like these model companies can cannibalize the use cases. Yep. When the foundational models improve, some of the things that the applied applications do will just get eaten by the improvements of the foundational model. Especially, I think about the enterprise use case that could very much happen where OpenAI or an Anthropic gets very concerned about revenue and they focus on enterprise usability and security and guardrails as a way to say, we want our next foundational model to have that almost inherent to the model itself.
Yeah.
Let's start with your opinion on the Perplexity Search GPT thing. And then, how do you think about the foundational models and those companies potentially thinking of this as core to them?
Yeah, totally makes sense. So, starting with the first component of that, the Perplexity versus OpenAI thing, like, this was obviously coming, right? Like OpenAI obviously wanted to do this. I don't think it will have been a surprise to the team at Perplexity. In my opinion, in my experience, it's extremely difficult to build a successful brand that's both a consumer brand and an enterprise brand and a developer brand, right? If you look at the set of companies in the world that have ever actually done a really, really great job in all three, it's extremely limited. Like, okay.
Well, even when it happens, it's usually different products.
It's usually completely...
Not even OpenAI that's trying to do the same product with their audiences, right?
Exactly, right. You can argue that, okay, Amazon has this pretty amazing enterprise brand in AWS and a pretty amazing consumer brand in shopping. There are certainly companies that, that have big businesses in both spaces, but the brands usually suck in one or the other. Google's a great example, like incredible consumer brand, but like enterprises kind of hate Google, right? And Microsoft is sort of the opposite, right? It's an incredible enterprise brand, but consumers kind of hate it. And so OpenAI, people forget that as a business, it's still very, very young, right? And it hasn't actually figured out. We all kind of know it's going to be $1 trillion company, right? But is it going to be $1 trillion company as a consumer company, as an enterprise company, as a developer company, something in between, all three? Like, it is still experimenting and still trying to figure out what the answer to that question is. And so, if I was Sam Altman, I would definitely be running as many of those experiments as I can to figure out, which at least one and, maybe two of those three end up being like the thing that makes OpenAI. So inevitable, that experiment has to happen. It will be difficult for them to like successfully build a consumer, developer and enterprise brand that's absolutely gigantic. But, obviously you don't necessarily want to bet against a horse like OpenAI at this point. In general, like to your second point, how do you think about, the foundational models expanding and trying to eat more of the world? It's a really, really good question. I think obviously in the long term, it will be the case that there'll be a handful of foundational model companies, right? Google will be in the mix. Anthropic will probably be in the mix. OpenAI will obviously be in the mix. And what we've seen from like our biggest customers, like the 1,000 to sort of 20,000 plus organizations, is that for them, they are very, very cautious about being locked into one foundation model provider, right? They've already been stung by like looking at their like AWS bill and being like, how the, XXX are they like paying this much money to AWS every year? And, they'll go and try and negotiate with AWS and AWS are like, sorry, we don't do negotiations. And when you're Walmart, you're not used to like your vendors saying like, sorry, we don't do negotiations. But this is what these enterprises have had to learn when they're speaking to the cloud vendors. And I think they're very, very hesitant to go back into that world again. And that's why you see this very early initiatives, not just to like invest in open source, but to also invest in swappability, right? And I think it's part of the reason that tools like LangChain got popular very quickly is because folks at these enterprises knew from day one they don't want to make the mistakes of cloud again. They don't want to get stuck with an inescapable, $200 million OpenAI bill 10 years from now. So how do we make it really easy to move between the models? So I do think that certainly like when people are building applications internally, they will focus a lot on being able to swap models. When it comes to doing like consumer chat or even just like if you're an enterprise buying like a chat UI, there I think companies will probably just pick their favorite and like go with that. And some folks will go with Google, some folks will go with OpenAI. But when you're actually building these more custom models that you need to own that drive the like core operations of your business, those things you can't really lock yourself into one provider. You have to be able to move between providers. And for that, I think, you'll see a lot of flourishing startups and a lot of flourishing businesses that don't have to worry that much about being eaten by one model or the other.
But then what about things, and this is how I think about your business, not in a bad way, but like I think this is an interesting challenge for you as a founder, where the core functionality all models might try to replicate. So for example, enterprise, like let's talk about the use case directly, right? Building secure enterprise applications might be something that Anthropic, OpenAI, maybe even Facebook, go like, okay, great. These models should have like inherent capability. Yeah. And maybe I'm also imagining that like I'm talking about GPT-6, where we're also seeing that these models self-create applications and UIs and get very competent. Yeah. And in the meantime, startups are building picks and shovels infrastructure around them, right? Yep. And when that starts to grow across all those models, what do you do as the infrastructure startup to say, oh, there's potentially, and maybe it's unimaginable, so you just go, I'll wait for it to happen, but there's potentially a moment where these models just become so competent that I wonder if it does the thing we make it do.
Yeah, well, there are some things that the models are just inherently not going to be able to do, right? So, for example, like when you're building like a KYC application, right? An application whose job is to make a decision about whether or not you should onboard this customer. the model might well get intelligent enough to make the decision, but it's never going to be built into the model the ability to read from your like internal onboarding system that you built in like 2007 or whatever, understand like how to interpret what each of the 28 fields in your like proprietary database actually mean, and make sense of that. So it may get smart enough to make the decision, but it's just like inherent to the concept of a large language model that it's never going to like understand the very, very specific custom details of how your business works. That's inherently proprietary information that will never make it into the like training systems of those models. So when I think about our business, right, what that means for our business is the future of our business is always going to be in these like very complex internal custom applications that are like unique to the customer. And they're not in these sort of verticals that are more like sort of straightforward that you can replace it with like a random SaaS app. So to give you an example of that, like I think the sorts of things that we're likely to replace are not things that are done in traditional SaaS tools today, but actually things that are built on some combination of Snowflake and Tableau or Retool and Airbyte and Fivetran, and you're stitching all that stuff together. That's what people use Credal to replace, right? They're not using Credal to replace something that was previously done in just some traditional SaaS tool. And that, I think, is the way that I would think about what the models will replace. The models will replace anything that could be like one for one done in some existing
So
SaaS.
it's more like it's like there will always be stitching as good as these models get, because especially in the enterprise, right, and maybe that's also the targeting of the segment, there's always this nuance that's worth putting around the models, because you're going to benefit from that marginal improvement of it grabs this, it puts safety here, especially usability wise, if you want like the nth layer of employee to be able to use it, right? Because that's where it's like, okay, great. If I'm Walmart, I want a cashier to be able to use it, requires a lot of safety and Rails. That's why, they definitely don't have access to things that, let's say, second layer, third layer of employee has access to.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. I guess the way I would maybe frame this is say, look, ultimately you want to be building stuff that gets better when the models get better. Right. You definitely don't want to be building stuff that gets worse when the models get better.
That's a great way to think about it for founders who are in that space.
Exactly. And so if you have something that is capturing the state of the world at the enterprise, right, and capturing the state of guardrails and controls that the enterprise want, then every time the LLM gets better, you are now like much more valuable, because the set of applications that the LLM can actually do at your enterprise because they have your software is like now much larger, right? So it's all about how do you build stuff? How do you build picks and shovels that get more valuable as the price of the gold goes up, and not less valuable as the price of the gold goes up?
Love that. I'm going to jump around here a little bit. I'm curious, you went through IC. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about that sometimes it's a default decision for people, so it could have been a default decision. But then the other thing I think about for anyone that's B2B is it's great, especially for people targeting SMB and startups, which you're not doing.
Yep.
So like you explicitly made the decision, and that's not your target market. So, and I say that because for those who, haven't heard that before, it's kind of obvious. If you become a YC company, you're selling something B2B, your first 1,000 customers can just come from the YC directory, and your logos are easy and all that jazz. Curious to hear your thoughts just generally going through it. What was your decision-making matrix going into it, especially again, given you were targeting the enterprise? That's maybe you'll tell us that it's actually useful for that too. And kind of in hindsight, what's your postmortem?
Yeah, really, really good question. If any of you guys are like thinking about YC or whatever, I do like super strongly recommend it, especially for first-time founders. The short version of the value proposition that I think it provided to us was twofold. Firstly, as first-time founders, Jack and I, we learned a lot about the venture process from YC. I think there's a lot of just like really arcane, weird etiquette and norms and like, tactical behaviors that you just are super non-intuitive. But when you hear someone explain them, you're like, oh yeah, like that makes so much sense. So there's one component, which is like the venture process, which I helped with a lot. There's another, I think, slightly subtler process that people don't necessarily realize, which is by far the hardest thing about starting a startup, is the emotional self-regulation that is required, right? And you go through these very, very difficult, very, very dark moments, right? You poured your heart and soul into this thing, and sooner or later you are faced with the reality that your thing sucks, right? And
speak for your thing, okay?
and you have to deal with that, right? And if you're doing that by yourself, if you're doing that alone, even if you're just doing that with like your one co-founder, it's so easy to get stuck in the sort of, what are we doing here? Let's just go home. And having a group of founders around you at that point in time, that is an incredibly valuable resource that's easy to undervalue when you are not living through that emotional pain. But when you are living through that emotional pain, it's impossible to undervalue. It's like so valuable. And so that, I think, is the subtler but equally important like value prop for YC.
That's a good story. Appreciate you sharing that one. I'm curious, from the perspective of fundraising, and you mentioned, that was obviously valuable to you to get the kind of 101. I'm just more curious, as a company building the picks and shovels in AI, I also have seen solutions that are adjacent to yours at other startups.
Sure, yeah.
It's probably complicated to raise, whether, again, it's kind of like people go, okay, the challenge is which one of these do I invest in? Or a lot of them might be worried about the foundational model companies, all these sorts of things. What have you learned, kind of being in the space as an AI company or an AI infrastructure company in terms of how venture is currently evaluating this ecosystem? Obviously, some people are worried also it's a bubble. It feels like a complicated space, for founders to navigate.
One of the things that's been super interesting for me to learn is actually less about convincing people that, your specific run rate today is worth such and such. It's more about, like, is there a really believable story here that this business has a 10%, 15%, 5%, whatever it is, depending on your stage of your business, that you can get to those like massive outcomes. And that's actually more important than the specifics of, the business as it is today, is how high is up.
Well, this is what when we, for those of you who in the audience are familiar, we do this weekly event, and we have this YouTube show called The Feedback Loop, where we give feedback to early stage founders on their pitch.
Yeah, I love it.
It's so funny because like half the time I'm going, hold on, all you told me is about today. I need to know about tomorrow, and that's what VCs need to understand fundamentally is like, hey, you have to actually have the probabilistic future you believe in as that venture capitalist. Because if you were going to want to bet on something based on cash flows, you might as well go to something in public markets.
Yep.
Much easier to actually evaluate. If you're investing in a private company, early stage all the way to probably growth, there has to be that story element. Last question for you, and then I'm going to the crowd, so prepare your questions. When you think about the biggest challenge building a platform infrastructure layer in AI, if you were giving a founder a piece of advice, like, hey, here's the thing that whether you're going to build, instead of security, you're building something that's for mobile, or you're building something that's for image generation. Here's a hint I want to give founders in this space, that you're going to have to that face that's not obvious from the outside.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard for me to tell what is and isn't obvious from the outside, to be honest. I think probably the single biggest piece of advice that I would give is one of these things that's like, maybe it is intellectually obvious, but it's much harder to grasp in practice than it is to like intellectually know this is like probably technically true, is that your customers know like today's problems much better than you do. You probably understand like how to solve those problems much better than your customers do, right? And so the tricky part is having the sort of discipline and the empathy, actually. Like, empathy is one of the most important traits in an early stage founder, to sit down with your customer, listen to them, really deeply put yourself in their shoes and understand the pain that they're feeling with their like current setup, but actually not listen too carefully when they start telling you about what you should do, right?
And in fact, almost ignore it as a rule.
Exactly.
Their solutions are stupid. I said it.
Your words, not mine. But you do have to be super, super careful when your customers.
Well, because they're not living in what you're trying to live in. And so the understanding, their job every single day is to understand their problem.
Yep.
Your job every single day is to understand potential solutions.
Exactly.
And I think your point is so great because a lot of founders get caught up in that feedback. And it's like, hold on. And I actually think like once you realize what you're realizing, then it's okay to ask the question.
Yep.
But I actually love there's like that thing you're saying of almost don't listen. And early stage, first time founders almost, you want to close their ears at some point in the conversation.
Right.
Okay, you got enough of the data, walk away.
And this is a big part of the reason why I use the word empathy and not sympathy, right? Like empathy is about understanding your customer's problem and like really being able to internalize it and like create a mental model of the world that represents your customer's reality really well. But like, if you veer too much into the sympathetic side of it, when your customer's like, oh, can you like build this feature? You'll like build this feature. And especially when you're building a platform business, like figuring out what the correct sort of perimeter of your product is versus what you want your customers to build on their side is like a really, really important part of the puzzle, right? You can't build everything.
Especially early days, you don't want to chase a big contract.
Exactly.
Especially the enterprise, yeah.
Exactly. And so threading that needle of really deeply understanding the customer's pain point, knowing how to solve it without actually just like trying to build every single feature that the customer asks for. That's actually a very artistic process. And you have to learn to trust your intuition. But the only way to do that is to learn how to listen deeply to your customer's pain and actually to not listen too deeply to your customer's proposed solutions.
Well said. I love that. All right, questions. Go for it.
All right. So you said that one of the fundamental theses that you're basing the success of your company on is that even as we move towards AGI, we're still going to need secure, trustable integration partners.
Yeah.
How do you view the competitive forces of Apple Intelligence and AI PCs over, like, obviously not now, but in the next 7 years to possibly be able to do that? And how are you thinking about that in the long term?
It's still early days, to be honest, right? With the evolution of these like local intelligences, the way that I strongly suspect will happen is that there will be like the sort of central, like more powerful intelligences that inherently have to run on the cloud because they're just like, massive scale. And as the industry moves forward, the like power of these like massive and cloud intelligences will increase as well. And so a lot of the like central planning and organization and like communication components will have to live in that central cloud. And then there'll be a ton of tasks that also ultimately become cheap enough to just do locally. And those coordination problems, I think, are the ones that are actually going to have the most value for the enterprise to solve, like internally. And then, when it's like, hey, I need to like write this email to this person to just say like, I'm going to take PTO off like next week. Yeah, that will probably be done on your like local AI LLM, but also it's not the like most valuable, most important decision making at the organization, right? And so that really critical, like super valuable decision making that's very unique to the way that your business works. My view is that those will continue to belong to like the most intelligent models that exist.
Well, part of what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, like the part of the other zeitgeisty thing that you're sitting on top of is companies have gotten very good at putting everything in the cloud and across a lot of tools in real time, because otherwise it would be the case that a local model in 5 years, a person's downloading a bunch of files and then says, fine, I can ask 17 different files a thing. But we're now living in a world where companies have enterprise companies included, have successfully adopted almost too much of a cloud mentality, and everything is all over the place and in real time.
Yeah.
And in a way where everyone wants the real-time answer of what is happening today. And so it's almost impossible for someone to localize their enterprise level questions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if I have a question, right, about Credal, the probability that all of the necessary information to answer that question lives on my computer is 0, right? There's so much data that's just stored in these like random SaaS tools. Like Credal's a 10-person company and somehow we have 50 SaaS tools, right? We have like 5 SaaS subscriptions for every employee. Obviously, not all of the data from all of those SaaS tools lives on my computer, right? So there's inherently a lot of these like more complex strategic decision-making questions that need to interact with.
It's a new version of orchestration.
A new version of orchestration, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Next question.
What are some industries that currently have a very high use case for your company, and what are some industries that you expect down the line for the use cases you might use?
Yeah, really good question. So basically for us, our focus is very much on the like regulated industries. I chose that very deliberately, partly, I guess, because of Jack and I's background, but also partly because in my view, there's a very strong correlation between the industries that matter the most to human welfare, like what actually changes your life and my life and like the lives of the people that you love and care about, tends to be the sort of stuff that is so important that the government cares a lot about how it's done, right? And so, we're very mission-oriented people. We really wanted to work on the things that matter, like to our lives and to the lives of the people that we care about. So we focus very like aggressively on regulated industries. I think one of the things that we expect to see transition is that we get away from the focus of just textual data as like core component of what generative AI is actually useful for. And increasingly, the multimodal stuff becomes better. I know that we hear a lot about multimodality today, but actually like a lot of the multimodality still kind of sucks. It's still surprisingly difficult to get the multimodal stuff to read text and like interpret it correctly. That will obviously change, right? Like that won't be true forever, but it's still the case from what we've seen that the generative models specifically are not that useful for the really high value production use cases for like understanding like a driver's license. Like, is this a legit driver's license? What's the data on it? How should I interpret that? That kind of stuff will increasingly become more relevant, and therefore the production use cases with these like multimodal data will increase as well.
Over.
Some of the highly regulated industries just mentioned are actually super hard to reach. I'm curious, what was your design partner acquisition strategy in early days?
This is so embarrassing to admit. So it's a great question, right?
You made him sigh, so you know it's a great question.
So the reality of what actually happened here, right, was, and I kind of mentioned this, that the chief of staff idea died and we were screwed. And I had 150 investor calls lined up for 2 weeks' time after that like recording of the meeting with Latchell, where we realized the idea didn't make sense and wasn't going to work. And so I was like, okay, I have 2 weeks in which to like invent a business that will make sense. So Jack and I sat down and we were like, okay, well, we know we want to try this like platform idea with governance and security as a control. Like, what is a realistic thing that we can actually accomplish to show like progress in 2 weeks? And so we set ourselves the goal of just trying to find one like very well respected software company in a highly regulated space that would sign like an LOI or a pilot in 2 weeks. And we actually started with a YC directory. What are the like 1,000 plus person organizations? There's like really not that many of them at YC. 1,000 plus person organizations that work in highly regulated spaces that are probably looking to adopt generative AI, but have security controls or concerns around doing so. So we made a list of like literally, it must have been maybe max 20 companies, right? And we were like, okay, well, we're going to send 20 emails and hopefully one of them responds. And actually, when we looked up the CISOs of these organizations, there was this one guy, Michael, at Checker. I don't know if you guys know Checker, but the biggest background checks provider in the US. About 1,500 people. And the CISO, Michael, he had on his LinkedIn profile that he spoke Klingon, right? So I was like, okay, I'm going to write him an email in Klingon, right? And I sent this cold outbound in Klingon.
Using AI, or how'd you?
Yeah, I translated it using AI. That's right. And he responded. He was like, so there were actually 2 responses from those 20 emails. One from Michael, one from a big pharmaceutical company. And
Are you surprised there were only 2 responses given the YC connection?
2 out of 20 is actually really good when you're emailing 1,000 plus person organizations. Okay, I think like if you're emailing the founders of like a 10-person
fair enough.
company,
at that point, the YC relationship's a little less relevant. Yeah.
Because we're also not emailing the founders, right? I'm emailing Michael, the CISO.
Right.
Like he roughly cares about YC, but he doesn't care that much, right? And so these 2 people responded. Michael, when we got on the call with him the next day, and he brought like 10 like people from Checker to like evaluate us. He brought the general counsel, like the head of finance, and we were like, okay, these guys are actually quite serious, right? Like they're actually like trying to buy this thing. And we quoted a number that like sounded astronomically like absurd to us. And they just sort of nodded along and were like, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Like, let's try and get this done. And there was this like whole palaver around, getting a data protection agreement in place with OpenAI, which we had to like scramble to do in 24 hours. But, basically that was a sufficient indicator of seriousness that it kind of gave us the like sort of validation that we needed to like double down at that point in time. And then like, ironically enough, we were so focused on just solving and like winning that pilot contract and turning it into an enterprise contract that we basically stopped doing GTM. We stopped doing go-to-market. But the irony is, like, as soon as we launched, there were so many companies that wanted this that we just started getting inbound from businesses that I genuinely thought it was like a scam. You know, when TransferWise, the head of like the ML platform team at TransferWise emailed me, and I was like, there's no way this is real, right? There's absolutely no way. And I got on the meeting, and lo and behold, it was the exact same thing. You know, Mark brought like...
You're actually in a weird AI experiment. These are all deepfakes. These customers are all deepfakes.
I mean, these deepfakes are paying us a lot of money. So, yeah, and you know, it just kind of kept happening that way. And I think this is one of the sort of crazier things about like where we are as a business right now is like the pain points and the needs are so acute at these enterprises that actually the buyers are out there looking for like the providers that work for them. And I think if you have a differentiated approach as an AI company, which, you know, I believe like we are very differentiated in the way that you go to a lot of these AI companies, they're like, you know, we have the cleverer RAG, we have the better model, and we're like, we just give you the best visibility and control in the industry. And it's quite a different sort of brand, and it's a different approach. And I think if you have that, and you have something that actually speaks to the buyer, then amazingly, the buyers are actually pretty sophisticated at finding you. And funnily enough, the enterprise buyers are better at finding you than the SMBs, because the enterprise buyers have someone whose whole job it is to make sure that they're using the best thing that they can. Whereas the SMBs, like, nobody has any time to do that. It's just like, let's ship something as quickly as possible. So I found, at least from my experience, you know, your mileage may vary, that it's actually easier to get inbound and enterprise interest than it is to get inbound from like the SMB market.
Final question.
Thank you. Do you have any stories about how you decide on price for something like this, especially given like AI and these tools are so new?
Yeah, it's like really, really good question. All the questions, by the way, have been amazing. It began with us basically just making up a number, right? That we thought sounded absurd. And your customer like either laughs at you or they don't, right? And I always assumed that every time I said a number, I always assumed the customer would just laugh at us, right? And it wasn't until like I'd quoted the first number, which I thought was astronomical. It wasn't until I quoted a number 2 orders of magnitude higher than that someone was actually like, no, like that's ridiculous. And that, you know, that's like a very organic discovery process of like, you know, you just keep saying things and getting the feedback and like working with the customer. I think alongside that discovery process is like understanding how valuable actually is this to your customer. Because certainly your job as a founder is to figure that out, and also to figure out, how do I make it more valuable, right? It's this valuable today. How do I make it 5 times, 10 times more valuable this time next year? And so you're constantly asking the questions, not just of the actual buyer, but also of the like actual end users, to try and deeply understand, like, what am I really solving for you? What would you have to do if I didn't exist? And like, how do I capture enough of that value that I can run a functional business? But also, like, as a startup, you don't want to like price gouge your customers yet either, right? Because you want it to feel like a partnership. The beauty about being a startup is that you can be very creative in these moments. Whereas when you're a gigantic enterprise, you're the AE that's deciding on the price for that customer. Being creative about pricing requires you to like go 8 levels up as a founder, or, even one of the AEs on our team, like they can be very creative as needed.
Awesome. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so
very much.
Great.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me, guys.